Warm greetings. On behalf of the Wednesdays for Water, an initiative of the WforW Foundation, a think tank instituted as Citizens Collective, we welcome you to the 98th session of Wednesdays for Water on climate change, culture, and riverscapes. The objective of Wednesdays for Water is to engage in conversation with water experts, grassroots practitioners, policymakers, and youth to explore the complex intertwined issues associated with water and the possible solutions around it. We have expanded since then to have more activities like Friday Waters and the Monday Munching with Women for Water. Besides organizing water workshops, water walks and talks, seminars, special courses and conferences, panels to continue the water conversation in various possible ways. Please visit our website www.WforW.in for more details. For today's session, which is a part of the Riverscapes series to bring our conversations focus on the cultural connections. The objective of the 6 sessions Riverscapes series is to recognize the significance of waterways, their evolution and impact on social cultural aspects of community, and to encourage individuals in conserving this intensive and extensive resource. This series is conducted in collaboration with ICOMOS India, a council for monuments and sites, and led by Nishant Upadhyay from Dharatal. Now coming to the session's background. India is home to diverse cultural and religious beliefs and water bodies, and rivers have special place or spiritual place in all the cultures and belief systems. Civilizations like Harappan, Egyptian started along Indus Valley and Nile Valley around 3000 BC. People's lives were inextricably linked with the river systems. Unfortunately, as countries industrialized and modernized, the rivers started to degrade. Encroachments on the banks and indiscriminate discharge of all kinds of waste have converted them into large sewer networks. Given that rivers control the microclimate of a region, any change in its feature also affects the climate of that region. Its vicious cycle that's resulting in temporal and spatial variability of climate variables also changes the way we are conducting ourselves in everyday lives. Today, we have with us to discuss these various aspects of changing rivers and the cultures. We have with us Ashim Kumar Manna. We have Hannah John and Proshakha Maitra as discussant for the session. Ashim is a doctoral researcher at International Center for Urbanism at KU Leuven, Belgium. His research analyzes the overlaps of rapid urbanization, receding ecological resilience, and climate impacts on the Garhwal Himalayas. His research is supported by Kevin Living, Stitching Daida, and the J.N. Tata Endowment Fund. He is a trained spatial planning scholar from KU Leuven on a Vilros Scholarship, Urban Design from CEPT University, and Bachelor of Architecture from Jamia Millia Islamia. He is also the founding principal at Ek Tara, a collaborative design research practice that oversees a very well-known My Livable Cities magazine and its research and outreach activities. Our second speaker is Hannah John, who is an architect and hailing from Bangalore. She completed her MSc in Conservation of Monuments and Sites from the Raymond Lemmer International Center for Conservation at KU Leuven. So we are actually getting some representation from Belgium today, and it's quite nice. Her previous experience includes heritage awareness and documentation, and she's been associated with Dharatal since December 21 as a conservation architect. She's involved in a number of projects that are closely associated with rivers and their evolving significance in urban and rural historic landscapes such as Orchha, Gwalior, Lucknow, and many. We have a young discussant today, a young scholar Proshakha Maitra, who is also a consultant and with keen interest in wetland management and sustainability. She's worked with Government of India and several state governments in various conservation and developmental projects, and she is a junior research fellow at Environmental Design Consultants with not-for-profit initiative called Eco Development and Research Cell, and she receives the Responsible Citizen Grant from there. She's also a fellow at the WforW Foundation and responsible for organizing these Wednesdays for Water. And let's look forward to hearing to both the speakers and then see how Proshakha really takes questions to both the speakers from here on. So over to you, Ashim, and really looking forward to hearing both of you.
Yeah, thank you, Mansee. I'll just... I hope my presentation is visible.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'm Ashim, as Mansee has already introduced me. So I'll quickly start with the presentations. So my presentation is titled Himalayan Rivers from River to Operational Riverscapes. These two images on the first slide are actually of Gangotri town and of the Tehri Dam. So it quite highlights the contrasting references to which I will be making during my presentation. So before I start my presentation, I'll quickly describe about that what is the Himalayan crisis I really want to discuss. So Himalayas are like largely biodiverse landscape. So for example, there are 4 global biodiversity hotspots. Approximately 1.9 billion people depend on water, food, and energy on the Himalayas, and 10 major Asian river systems originate from the region. And the Himalayan forests themselves are a large global carbon sink. So what do I mean by operationalizing the Himalayan landscape? The increase of population and energy material demands in the Indian subcontinent are continuously fueling the capitalization of Himalayan resources. So for example, construction of large-scale dams, extraction of construction materials, making a lot of new roads and tunnels, which are increasing accessibility in the mountainous region, which is also resulting in the increasing urbanization of the region. So along all these development, there are also these narratives of contestation. So for example, mountains have been continuously pushed into the modernistic memory of Indian civilization, but how Bhakra at one point of time was referred as the new temple of modern India. And then if we see the ad from Ambuja Cement, it highlights that man's ability to control nature. But in contrast, what continues to happen because of all these infrastructural imposition, we see that there is significant amount of productive landscape which is being inundated. There have been series of flash floods there have been series of flash floods and natural disasters whose impacts have been aggravated by the presence of infrastructure within Garhwal. And the last image actually highlights the resistance of local women who continue to speak for themselves. So these women are part of the Vistapit, as you would call in Hindi, or the displaced people. So they till date continue to fight for their land rights in Garhwal. So before I describe a bit more on what is infrastructure doing in the mountains, I would also like to highlight that the building of infrastructure in Himalayan region is not very new. Since the colonial times, since 1850s, most of the rivers have been harnessed. So for example, if you see in the first image is actually from the Roorkee, where the first water canals or the first irrigation system to irrigate the Doab region was developed. And as you see now is the image of Haridwar, but you see this extensive series of canals, water diversion infrastructure. Similarly, if you go to the map, we see the kind of hydropower projects which are already proposed or are already operational, which are present within the landscape. So if we see, we have left no stretch of the river which is part of Ganga, Alaknanda, and Bhagirathi stream dam free. But what is this dam and infrastructural imposition doing to the landscape? It is creating this new competing zone, which is providing both opportunities and problems for the local residents. So for example, in this series of 4 images, the first 2 images highlight that how, especially on Tehri Lake, because of the dam, there's a new kind of economic activities which is taking place. On the other image, we see that degrading agricultural slopes are being now gradually taken up by solar power plants. The 2 images on the bottom also highlight that how the construction of large-scale infrastructure such as the Char Dham highway is also creating large scars on the landscape. So for example, you see how the terraces of the mountains have been cut, and we see these large gashes along the forested slopes. But before I describe about what we can do and how I'm trying to understand. I'll briefly describe about, how the riverscapes have been mapped, understood, and they are presently part of our culture. So, for example, this is one of the famous images, and this is also part of a famous tradition or a cultural, it's cultural event in Hinduism, the descent of Ganges. So, for example, it's described very well in Vedas and in a lot of traditional texts, that how Ganges river was basically caught between the locks of Lord Shiva, and then the Ganges was brought down to the earth. But what we see is the gradual development of these traditional practices also established the act of pilgrimage to landscape. So, for example, in Garhwal in 17th century, there were a series of maps which were prepared for both either to the route of Badrinath or the pilgrimage map of Char Dham Yatra. So what we see is that the depiction of the landscape, the qualities of the landscape, is combined with the traditional practices, like how there was this emergence of like worshipping at confluences, how specific temples were to be visited, and it all marked the way people were moving in the landscape. So this started to become part of a culture and ritualistic practices. In the 20th century, all these maps gradually became these modern maps where the travel of pilgrims within the landscape was facilitated by roads, railways. But what we see is that this imagery is still specifically carrying the references of historical imagery, of cultural artifacts, such as, for example, the Ganges descent is also drawn in this. It highlights, how all the specific temples which are at the foothills of the glaciers are present within the landscape. But what we see now, like, for example, this is a map which I got from Haridwar in 2020. So the same representations are continuously being redacted. But what we now see is that the landscape is now being more prominently described by its highways, its key factors, rather than the experience of the landscape. But if you look back, how were these discoveries made within Garhwal? So, for example, this is an image drawn by James Bailey Fraser, who was one of the first colonial explorers to visit Gangotri Temple in 1850s. In 1830s. So what we see in this image is the description of the landscape of what was present in the early 18th century. These explorations were also gradually followed by preparation of elaborate survey maps. So, for example, this is a survey map of the sources of the Ganga. So from Haridwar, all the respective sources to Yamunotri, to Gangotri, to Kedarnath and Alaknanda were mapped. And this sort of set in the tradition of mapping practices, which continues till date. What these mapping practices and explorations were doing were also the enumeration of the landscape in terms of its productivity, what was forest, what was not forest. And gradually these relationships became important in form of defining what was reserved forest, what was not reserved forest, what could be used by the people, what could not be used by the people. But what these relationships were drawing on the landscape were preparation of extensive maps, which were highlighted for extraction of specific resources. So, for example, this is a map of the Tehri state prepared in early 20th century. This describes what part of the forest, what kind of the river valleys could be exploited for timber, for medicinal plants. So gradually, what we see that what started as an early exploration gradually became a response to exploitation of natural resources, which continues till date. So, for example, this image is from a small village called Mukhba, which is en route to Gangotri. So, for example, where if someone from today's presentation would have taken this path, you would be very happy to see all these apple orchards. But what you see in this image is the clear destruction of the colonial deforestation. So now all these agricultural terraces, which we see as apple orchards or settlements, at one point of time were a result of large-scale deforestation which took place, which gradually did affect the local hydrology, the local climate at that point of time, and it continues to do so. I'll just quickly highlight how different kinds of mapping methods and understanding the landscape also becomes part of mapping and community action within the landscape. So for example, this is like a series of drawings from my own research, where I try to highlight, how forest, water system, basically how forest, the riverscapes, and agriculture and settlement are entwined within Garhwal's landscape. These are clearly inseparable. So this is one of the images of a small village, where we see that how the village's water resource, the water source has been highlighted. So it has a temple, and it has multifunctional practices which keep on going. So this is the place where women would wash their clothes. They would often also use this water for drinking and also household uses. But such water sources are continuously under pressure because of deforestation, increasing in cultivable area, also because of development of infrastructure, and also climate change impact and urbanization. Because of the climate change impact, a lot of these ground water sources are continuously drying up. So today I'll just briefly describe about Heval River. It is a tributary to the Ganga upstream of Rishikesh, and how small-scale activities, which was led by local people and especially women, helped reviving the river's watershed. So these 4 images highlight, the kind of environmental degradation which was taking place in the watershed. So, for example, dumping of muck, resources drying because of deforestation and reduced rainfall patterns, growth of invasive species within the local vegetation, which in itself was also hampering the landscape. So I was introduced to this project by the local forest department, which started to understand the local land use cover. So what they tried was to understand and map the various stages of forest degradation and increasing urbanization. So if you see in the maps from 1990 to 2000 to 2020, you see that there's a significant increase of scrubland, barren land, and settlements within the watershed. So what they tried to do was to understand how these mapping could actually help in initiating ground action in the landscape. So what they also started to do was to highlight and mark all the location of the water sources, the smaller streams, the major streams, and the bigger streams, and also identify area where reviving forestry or afforestation or reviving barren lands could help in water recharge. So what they started to do was to understand the relationship of the forest to water and the landscape. So they started mapping all the villages which were along the fringes of the forest, and started having these small scale functions. So for example, this is an image of Chal Khal, where you make these small terraces and you make a series of percolation pit, which would basically absorb water. And what was also observed was that they started making low cost, low intensive infrastructure. So for example, small check dams to store and recharge water during the monsoon seasons. But these activities were not just done by the forest themselves, by the forest department themselves. And for example, I was very happy that I was part of one of their conversation with the forest department. So for example, you see all these women who actually lead the conversation of what should be done with the forest, what kind of plants should be used in afforestation, where local women could actually find opportunities. So for example, in these images, we see that the women are part of the afforestry programs, and they themselves started to reap the benefits of water at their houses. And when the water was made more available at the villages, they could actually start up their own businesses and other functions. The women were also trained in making these low cost, low intensive, for example, infrastructure even at their household. So women started learning how to use bamboo to make these water tanks. So for example, one of them is Kidi Devi, whom I met personally, and she was explaining me, how she learned how to weave basically bamboo to make compost baskets and water tanks. And gradually, these learnings also became part of environmental literacy. And when there was availability of more water, people could, basically diversify their livelihoods through by basically rearing bees, rearing chickens, and also use their waste to have biogas. I mean, unfortunately, the biogas plant did not work because people felt that water was more crucial to actually feed animals and feed the livelihood. So some of these grassroots technologies were actually very successful, except for barring a few. But this resulted in families becoming more self-dependent, and families actually being more linked to their own personal landscape. So, for example, this is the house of Kidi Devi, where you can see her own vegetable garden, where from the increased income of her family, now she has a polyhouse which helps her grow vegetables during the winters. And the small kitchen garden also uses the wastewater which she collected. I mean, in the previous picture where you saw the water collection tank, she uses the water to basically sustain this specific garden. So, I mean, I would like to sort of end here to highlight that how our cultural practices of the riverscapes and how mapping practices at a very large scale can also be introduced at smaller scale, and they can impart benefits to the local community. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Ashim. Thank you so much for such a short and sweet presentation, or taking all the scales, from macro to micro scale, and telling the importance of mapping. And for me, the key takeaway is how the mapping, which was usually used for exploration, eventually is now more crucial and in fact most instrumental tool for the exploitation of the resource by humans. So thank you so much. We take more questions from all of you. All the participants are requested to put their questions in the chat box, as well as we will later let you ask questions directly also. So may I now invite Hannah to do her presentation so that we can get ready for the discussion. Thank you.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah, and thank you for the introduction. I'm going to quickly talk about one of our projects. Dharatal is the organization that I work with, and we are architects, and we also deal with conservation projects across the country. And one of our projects currently is with the government of Madhya Pradesh, and it is led by UNESCO New Delhi. We're the technical consultants. So we're applying an approach called the HUL approach, which is the historic urban landscape approach, in the case of the settlements of Orcha and Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh. Yeah, so like I said, this is led by UNESCO New Delhi, and it's supported by Madhya Pradesh Tourism Board. Madhya Pradesh Tourism Board approached UNESCO New Delhi in 2021, requesting for this the HUL approach, which has never been applied in India, to be done in the case of these two pilot settlements. One being Gwalior, which is a more urban settlement in urban case, and Orcha, which is a more idyllic town. So yeah, I'll just quickly take you through to give you a little context of the objectives of the project and the approach, and also just a very brief bit of how we are dealing with the river and how it's affected the settlements and what is happening at present in terms of increased development pressure. So yeah, the HUL approach, our main objective is to incorporate cultural heritage as a catalyst. So we're not saying no to development, but we're saying yes to managed development while curbing negative impacts on the cultural heritage assets that are already existing in these settlements. Another objective of ours is to finally develop guidelines and recommendations for the case of Orcha and Gwalior, and also to establish interdepartmental communication and undertake capacity building, which is one of our very important step in our methodology, is constant engagement with the stakeholders, both public and local community, and to eventually come up with guidelines which will be reflected in the city development plan and hopefully curb negative impacts. A quick phases of the project. So we started with secondary data collection with whatever we could get from the urban local bodies. And we also conducted primary data collection in the form of surveys. We did around, our sample size was around 300 in Gwalior, and in the case of Orcha, around 250. And you'll see what results we were able to see. And based on our data collection, we did a data analysis. And from that came scenarios where we tried to demonstrate the impacts of various developmental projects that are ongoing, some already completed. But yeah, and finally, we formulated recommendations and also sample architectural guidelines in both cases, Orcha and Gwalior. Can skip this, but yeah, the outcomes of the HUL program is for better strategies, keeping cultural heritage at the core of it all. And another very important aspect is investment opportunities. HUL opens new investments and market opportunities in cultural heritage and sustainable development goals. It contributes to the sustainable development goals, especially goal number 11. Adaptive reuse, innovative adaptive reuse of structures that are already present in these very dense urban situation of Gwalior as well as in Orcha. So cultural heritage is a very important asset in both these cases. So using these for development, and it's basically saying cultural heritage assets and natural heritage assets are at the core of all development schemes. Now, in the case of Orcha, also in the cover page, if you noticed, we did like a mapping of the river. This is the Betwa River. Orcha is a historic capital of the Bundela dynasty, and it's on the river valley of the river Betwa, and the two tributaries, which is Jamni and Ghurari, meet at Orcha. So as you can see, this the triangle little patch is the inner fortification of Orcha, and the red line that you see around it is the outer fortification of Orcha. And you see how important the river is to it, since it engulfs it towards the south and the northeast. And beyond the river is the Orcha Wildlife Sanctuary. Again, there is a protected eco-sensitive zone and a 2-kilometer buffer, excluding the settlement, which is also, it's a very important element of the historic urban landscape in the case of Orcha. So just a quick glimpse of everything that is Orcha. You see built heritage, you see the Ram Raja temple, which is at the center of the whole town, because Lord Ram is considered the king of Orcha. And even all administrative duties, the king or Lord Ram is considered the chief. And even a simple thing such as the commissioner going to the temple first thing every working day to salute the deity so that he can start his duties. That's how intrinsically it is linked to Orcha and the story. And you also see how the riverscape is important with these dotted built heritage in terms of palaces, in terms of temples. This is the landscape of Orcha. Quickly, like I already mentioned, the Betwa River and the two tributaries meet here. And apart from this, there's also agricultural lands around the town, also within the outer fortification. And the Betwa River is seasonal, and most of 80% of the rainfall that Orcha receives is during the 3 months in the monsoon, and this leads to flash floods, and you will see what that has led to. I mentioned that we did primary data collection. So as part of our survey, some of our questions were, where do you prefer to go for recreation? And the river ghats was one of the major responses, and 92% of them said they enjoy going to the river ghats. So that's how close the people are to the river. And the river, the fort, and the various temples, and especially the Ramraja temple, are 3 main cores of the built heritage aspect of Orcha. And some of the challenges we identified were, of course, developmental pressure. You can see in the picture we've circled these piers that it's an ongoing construction of a bridge. But right next to that, you can see another bridge, which is a historic stone bridge that used to exist across the river, which connected, the wildlife sanctuary Tikamgarh to Orcha, which was it's the only access from Tikamgarh to Orcha. If not, they have to take a huge bypass. So because of these flash floods, the stone arch would get flooded, and the state government thought it was priority to build an alternative bridge, and you'll see how it has been executed. Another challenge is public infrastructure. The survey indicated that the absence of a sewerage system in the town, septic tanks are used for disposal of black water from the toilets, and growing developmental pressure in the near future will result in contamination of the groundwater. Some of the other challenges is the natural landscape falls within the floodplains, as I said, and this poses a threat to some of the built heritage along the river bank as well. The management of floodplains of rivers was previously under the jurisdiction of the central government, and it has now been passed on to the state through the floodplain zoning bill, which is in its nascent stages currently. So based on our inferences and challenges, MP Tourism requested us to do heritage impact assessments for some of the major infrastructure projects that are ongoing, that are in talks. So we identified 4 of them. One is this 3.75 meter road that was being planned within the outer fortification, but between 2 historic gates. Another was a stadium, and there were also 2 bridges. One was the bridge that I already showed you, the southern bridge, which connects Tikamgarh to Orcha, and the other is a bridge in the north across the Betwa River. So we conducted these heritage impact assessments following ICOMOS guidelines. And I won't get into the details, but quickly, just to bring to your attention, the northern bridge was proposed recently. They also included a new ghat or riverfront with public toilets and changing rooms, as you can see. And this is in addition to the main access bridge, which already exists, which is the only access that they have to the inner fortification. So yeah, we conducted a HIA, and I'm happy to say that we were able to convince them to put this project on hold. So this is currently not happening, which is quite a win for us. This is also like further how we justified how this project would affect the views and view sheds in Orcha, like which is a when you look into the planning of the fortification, and it's very evident that the rulers had a very good understanding of the topography of views and visual lines between structures. The Chaturbhuj temple and the Ramraja temple is very important when it comes to Orcha. Also, this beautiful landscape of this rocky river. And you, from wherever you are, you see the the Chaturbhuj temple. So this is important in all aspects. So we highlighted this in our inferences, and also in the heritage impact assessment, and said how this would be, the visual impact that the project would have if executed. The other bridge to the south, as I mentioned, this is a picture of the stone bridge that used to exist and that used to flood. To show you pictures of what it looks like at present, there are these 8-meter tall, columns holding a bridge. So we don't know what kind of assessment they did of incoming traffic, and we don't know if there was a mobility assessment, what was the need for the project, and are the ends of where they meet the main settlement and where it meets the wildlife sanctuary, were they planned sensitively? All these are questions that we raised, but it was unfortunately too late for us to push for stopping the bridge, as you can see. Moving on to Gwalior. Gwalior is the city that is landlocked and in between the plateau, Malwa Plateau, the Bundelkhand Plateau, and the Gangetic Plain. And also one extension of the Malwa Plateau is where we see the Gwalior Fort on a hillock, and that overlooks, the rest of the city. In the case of Gwalior, it is quite contrary to Orcha. Orcha is quite hidden, and it's also in the name. Onche means hidden. And in the case of Gwalior, you see it as a trade center, and also has seen multiple northern Indian kingdoms reign Gwalior. So it's very layered and strategically located at transport corridors. As you can see, this is an image of the Maharaj Bada in Lashkar in Gwalior, where you see so much activity, and you see cultural heritage, you see people, you see bazaars and markets, and also nature. So just to quickly capture the historic urban landscape. And in the case of Gwalior, there are two seasonal rivers that pass the city. One is the Swarnrekha River, and the other is Morar. They are seasonal, and the Swarnrekha River, unfortunately, along the stretch of the city, most of its urban stretch has been channelized and reduced to what you see here. There is only one instance where a public space has been planned around along the river, which is called the Phoolbagh area of the city, but the rest of it is more or less like this. Also the same, there is also a number of water bodies and ponds that are within the urban area, man-made, like the Beja Tal, which is also a very important performance space now. Gwalior is very well known for music. It is the place of Gwalior Gharana music, Drupad, and a lot of events happen around these urban, water holes. Some of our key influences were, again, during our primary data collection, our question was, do you visit the Swarnrekha? And 56% of people said yes, frequently. It has immense potential as a public space, and it passes through most of the dense areas, especially Lashkar and Old Gwalior, Hazira. Some of the other challenges that we noticed were in terms of public infrastructure, again, sanitation. There are gaps in the network, and damages cause leaks in the river, therefore polluting it. And environmental pressure, again, because of flash floods of the Swarnrekha, which have been documented previously. There is a risk of waterlogging in some areas in the city, and this is also a result of impermeable ground surface. So and also that Swarnrekha River, there is a 12-kilometer proposal of an elevated road planned on top of the river. You could see that it's reduced to a drain now. So the priority of the government was was to ease transport in the city rather than the ecological value of the seasonal river. So we did again a scenario of impact to demonstrate the impact of this elevated road project. Yeah, as you can see, we noted the stretch, and we brought up how if the project is to happen, then the fabric along the edges of the river would deteriorate, and people would be encouraged to dispose garbage, which is what we see in a lot of cities. And although it eases a lot of the traffic concerns, its construction can lead to the permanent ecological damage of the river. While again we were unfortunately too late to stop or to convince the government. We did want to suggest mitigative measures. So we said that advertising boards should not obstruct the views. We were trying to go for making the best of what is going to happen. So we said that the design should not encourage solid waste disposal, and the underside of the project should be designed so that the local community still has a connect with the river. During some of our stakeholder engagements, we were told by the local community that a lot of them who've grown up in Gwalior have learned how to swim in the Swarnrekha River. So even with all this interaction with the urban local bodies, it's their priority was on mobility. So yeah, we tried to again, in our scenario impact, we tried to demonstrate what it would look like with respect to the view from the Gwalior Fort. And we also suggested that it should be well integrated with the existing pedestrian network, and probably even include viewpoints from this project to the fort and to the so that the people are still again, like I said, making the best of the worst sort of situation, some sort of mitigative measures. And we also showed them examples of how it's been done around the world, where they've done this whole urban regeneration below a lot of elevated roads and highways. So yeah, this is a quick presentation. Like, we win some battles and we lose some, and we're very glad we were able to make a difference in the case of the Northern Bridge in Orcha. And yeah, the whole point of the HOL project is these small solutions that translate into significant results. In the case of this bridge, it was we just did a heritage impact assessment, that a preliminary one, and tried to convince them that this would be the effect, and this is how we think that this idyllic town in Madhya Pradesh should remain the same, and this bridge would give this sort of negative impact, and we want to curb this. So yeah, we tried to do our best. That's it from my side.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for showing two case studies where the river is almost at stake in the hands of development. So good 3 case studies you have. And Proshakha, I welcome you now to really ask questions to the speakers. And one case study, you definitely just had a chance like 2 weeks ago to travel with me to the Himalayas and see some of the things which Ashim was talking about. And thanks, Hannah, for showing Gwalior, where I started my career. And we were really looking at these issues at a very tender age in life. So we didn't realize what development can bring in. Being an architecture student, we were so pro-development in the beginning. And after traveling for 30 years in the field, I think I'm among those people in the country who would really talk about de-development more than development. So I really feel very nostalgic with your presentation, Hannah. Orcha is also close to my sasural. So I will have a lot of questions for you as well as the projects which you have done. But meanwhile, may I invite Proshakha to really raise her arguments and questions with both the speakers. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank both our speakers for their insightful sharings and for showing us how doubtful our future is when the development around us doesn't concern the environmental consequences. I think all of us are very enriched after listening to this, and we have some questions. Let us quickly start our discussion. So I would like to ask my first question to Mr. Ashim Manna. The effects of climate change and unplanned development are undeniably being faced by everyone in the present times. We are a witness to the extreme heat waves in the eastern part, as well as untimely occurrences of western disturbances in the northwestern regions. So, do you think that as the human race, we still have the power to regulate such changes, say by reviving our connections with the nature and natural bodies? A connection which we can say has gradually faded over time.
Thank you, Proshakha. I think I'll just give a reference of what I experienced on site. So, for example, I did talk about how forests at one point of time were detached from being common property, or let's say public commons, as we know. So, I mean, living in the Himalayas has always been linked with water and forest. And at a certain point in time, when the Forest Act was introduced, and it was introduced across all of India, and forests were basically made the state property. No one could basically touch upon forest because it belonged to the colonial powers. So what happens is that till date, the forest actually is like a state subject. So what I realized in going in one of these villages at Rethel, that even having such strong pressures, or let's say jurisdiction controls and boundaries which has been drawn by state, people in the Himalayas still continue to live in close relationship with the forest. So for example, a lot of substantial fuel wood still comes from the forest. A lot of fodder for their own animals comes from the forest. Now, given the forest has a lot of restrictions, but there are these new forms of livelihoods. For example, people of this one specific village, they actually go to the forest to collect certain parts of their diet on a daily basis. They also collect certain, medicines which they have been using traditionally. And they feel that, these are the things which make them connected with the landscape rather than, let's say, the modern materials and modern way of living and things. I mean, they have continued to embrace the modernities which are coming to them. They have not rejected them, but these local communities, which are, let's say, more ecologically well connected, continue to do so. And I would say we can really learn a lot from them. People like us who live in Delhi, Bombay, or let's say, big cities, we have significantly lost the historic relationships which he had with landscape. Landscape for us now means more recreational rather than being connected. It gives fruit, it gives food, water, and so many things. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir. I would like to ask my next question to Ms. Hannah John. I would like you to share with us that how can citizens at the individual level stop this change from happening? And like you discussed in your presentation, in some ways or the other, we all know that the surroundings around us are changing for the worse. But all of us still feel that I alone can't stop it if the entire system doesn't change. So how do you think that we can address this mindset, and how important a single man's action can be? Hannah, ma'am.
Thank you, Proshakha. So this came up a lot in our stakeholder engagements, especially last March. We had a stakeholder engagement in Gwalior with the local community, and a lot of their questions. This included, representatives of the resident welfare associations. It included people owning heritage property. It included travel and tourism operators. And it included, NGOs and all these people. And they asked the same question: how can we make a difference. And if we see a project like this that we think should not happen, how do we approach the government? And I think the people always have the power. I know it's a very maybe idealistic thing to say, but we can't stop doing this, right? It's our home, and it's our responsibility to bring this up, to join Residents Welfare Association, to take part in the public process. Yeah, it comes down to that. Even heritage property owners, a lot of them brought up how they can form a network, and even a common platform. They asked for a common platform where they can all come together and voice their problems and to the state government. And the thing is, in most cases, the government is willing to listen to what the people want to say. So it's all about mobilizing this action, and yeah, we can't stop doing our bit, and it definitely makes a difference.
Thank you. We can take up questions from the participants, if any.
Okay, maybe I start with warming up. And my question to Ashim first, and Proshakha, you may ask your questions, continue, because you have more room in the session. So Ashim, looking at the way you were describing how in the initial time, the mappings were used for exploration of various natures, whether it is cultural, whether it is spiritual, whether it is even pilgrimage, and even for that matter, doing your livelihoods and, nature protection as well. But the way we see now the mapping today, coming from architecture, urban design background, and with planning orientation of the entire development process in the country, maps definitely have evolved. They are much more sophisticated than the past. Now, coming to the mapping of rivers out of the mapping system, somewhere my personal feeling is that we have really failed to map river in the right way, in the sense that mapping of river has become a kind of a mechanical administrative process which almost ignores the very fact of mapping the floodplains. Putting simply, a line on the floodplain has failed the river the way it should be seen as. And then eventually those lines have become like, set in stone lines for administration. And they have been a huge contributor to the way we have looked at rivers and the way we are doing all kinds of development along the river. And the current riverfront development is a classic example for it. How did they come up with these lines of rivers? So because you have been doing archival study of maps from then and now, where do you see we really lost this whole understanding of river in the mapping process? Because mapping for light understanding of, everyday life to mapping for development are completely two different tasks. Like maybe making a map for pilgrims is a completely different task than developing the whole civilization, which is city. So where did we really lose the track? So I'm just curious.
Thank you, Mansee, for a very difficult question. First, when I was doing a lot of my own archival research, and because of the nature of my work, though I do try to investigate, how settlement practices have been happening in Garhwal, but I often bumped into, for example, these temple priests and people. So one of the interesting, things which came out from the conversation was that how were we mapping earlier? There's one very interesting way of putting this forward, that, for example, in Hindu culture, the way we would actually describe our gods and goddesses were actually the description of a specific map. For example, this whole concept of, how Shiva's hair is basically capturing Ganges water. It's signifying this whole phenomenon that, the Ganges does not have a single source. It emerges from the innumerous glaciers and so many tributaries. I mean, I think more than like 1,000 tributaries in the upper Ganges catchment itself. I mean, we have to see how fantastic our imagination at one point of time was, that, it is saying that, that's the way it transcends, and then it comes to, I mean, for example, Haridwar. Haridwar is called, let's say, Gangadwar, then Ganges emerges. So these concepts were also being utilized in a lot of, let's say, paintings. For example, Pahadi paintings, which were being produced in both Kangra and also Garhwal. So the representation of map had a lot of imperfection because it was not trying to measure something perfectly. The whole perfection started to came from colonial mapping, because it started becoming more precise, because mapping was not basically colonial mapping was not about traditions and cultures and practices. It was about how much revenue can we generate by measuring this. So for example, if I know this is the line of the river, so it means this much of water I can have, gradually then this whole concepts of canals in southern India and northern India came up. I mean, if they could measure forest, if they could understand what species of forest were, then, they could understand, how much of hardwood we could, I mean, for example, you've recently been to Rishikesh. Rishikesh actually at one point of time was a swampy forest, but you don't see forests around Rishikesh. You only see buildings. So we have to understand that, how the revenue department, and if you look at the history of Survey of India, so for example, Survey of India was even established before, I think 18th century. I think it was established in 1756. The whole concept was to maximize revenue for the British East India Company. That's how the mapping started happening. So it was about both natural resources, geological resources, even census counts were actually introduced at that time. So that whole tradition continues to be present till date. Even today's Survey of India actually uses the same technique, same methods. We have a more scientific and, let's say, engineered way, but it is not interdisciplinary anymore. It's only mapping. Oh, this is a road, we measure a road. If this is a forest, we measure a forest. If this is a settlement, we only, look into the boundaries of the forest, what is unbuilt, what is cultivable, and things like that. There's a very interesting book, I mean, which I think can also help people present in today's presentation. You would know Dilip Da Kuna. He recently wrote, not recently, I think it's almost like 4 or 5 years ago, he wrote a book. It's called Ganges Descent. So he talks of how, I mean, this whole concept of mapping became more discipline specific rather than being interdisciplinary. That's how I think the moment mapping became very discipline specific, we lost the case. And it continues in agriculture, in urban planning, in climatology, in engineering studies, everywhere. Because we are expert of our own field, we don't include other disciplines.
Yeah, very well put. I think this whole perfectionism was also the reason of exploitation, because it's like, chicken and egg. I mean, for exploitation, we required more perfection, and I think perfection helped to exploit more from the resources. So before Proshakha takes it over from me, a quick question to you, Hannah. When you work on projects like Gwalior and Orchha, which are, I will say, mid-sized towns, and when you reach out to people and talk about cultural heritage, where river is an integral part, or water bodies become integral part of cultural heritage. But have you even try to really see some kind of comparative, narrative from people? What do they weigh more? For example, in Orchha and, in Gwalior, is the fort more important or the river more important? What are they willing to give away? And my perception, or some studies many years ago, is that people are able to relate more with the built heritage than the natural heritage. And that's where we toss it out, and keep it open. Again, a public commons, where which added layers of administration makes it worse for them to be protected. What is your experience from Orchha? I mean, I have lived in those places for many years, and we still travel there because, as I mentioned, it's my hometown now, Gwalior. So what did you feel, I mean, during the projects? Because you went through surveys and focus group discussions and all. Did you really get this sense, or it's just my wrong perception?
That's so interesting. In the case of Gwalior, I think people were more willing to give up the river and natural assets. But in the case of Orcha, I think people are much more linked and connected with the river and the forest and everything, yeah, natural. I think it's a reflection of what we're surrounded with, because built heritage is, I mean, it's permanent. It's there. In the case of Gwalior, because it's been the river is not recognizable anymore. So
It's
people
nala.
don't.
It's a nala.
Yeah, it's a nala right now. So
Most part of it is concretized.
yeah, so most of the young population there does not even know there's a river there.
It's a river. Mm-hmm. But do
I
you think the nature of the river really makes a difference? Because at Orcha, it's really wide. Huh? I mean, we can see the root of the river in the monsoon. Whereas in Gwalior, it may flood, but the river it's already tamed for long time. You know.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, even there's a lot of silting, and it's yeah, it's definitely reduced, and that's again that's why people don't feel the need to prioritize reviving the river anymore. Even the government does not feel the need to do it, and they want to prioritize mobility and ease of transport from one end to another. And yeah, it's sadly.
I hope they don't make a highway on the river itself, which is also being tried out at few places. But
that is exactly what is happening with the elevated project. It is above the river, so
yeah, that's pity. Over to you, Proshakha. Yeah.
So one small thing to Mr. Ashim Manna, as you showed us in your presentation that the future of the plains also depend a lot on the mountains. And recently we've also witnessed that how development is changing the entire landscape. So how would you suggest that we sensitize the people, particularly the youth? Because at the end of the day, everything comes from the people. So how do you think should be our way forward in this scenario?
Very youth-like question. Ashim, go ahead. All of you are youth for tomorrow. Huh? So I'm quite happy to hear this.
During my fieldwork, I mean, I did two long fieldwork periods after the COVID, and I did get to interact a lot with a lot of the youngsters in the mountains. Some of them, young people are quite aware of the kind of repercussions they may have. I mean, for example, right now, this whole concept of social media, which is linked to tourism, is driving a lot of youth to be part of, let's say, non-mainstream livelihood activities. I mean, for example, I mean, even if you go on social media, you'll find so many of them, you know, who claim them to be basically trek guides, you know, who have their own specific Instagram pages. And then they say, you know, if you come to this specific valley, you know, if you come to Gangotri, I can do that. If you come to, you know, Kedarnath, we are happy to help you. Some of them do have this sensitivity. I mean, for example, I got to work with this one guy. I mean, basically, I was, you know, taking his help during my fieldwork. He basically posed the same question that, you know, if I don't become part of the mainstream, then I do not have a lot of livelihood opportunities, because if I really look at the livelihood opportunities in the mountains, they are straight away linked with the land. So when it means, you know, you really have to toil a lot with your farmland, and then managing a farm in the mountains means you have to also look into the forest, which gives you a lot of resources to, you know, practice cultivation. And also you have to have livestock. I mean, because land in the mountains is not big, you know, so you can't have a tractor and, you know, it will till the land and things like that. So you really have to use animals. So they said it is becoming complex. One, a lot of the people in the mountains have migrated outwards. I mean, because they feel if we are significantly educated enough, you know, we can go to Dehradun, or we going to go to Delhi. I mean, people from Garhwal are now even working in Kerala and Bangalore as well. I mean, they take all sorts of jobs. I mean, both technical jobs, teaching jobs, and even working in the hotel industry and stuff. I think this is an important question that, the youth which will take forward the landscape ahead has to be connected. I mean, unfortunately, I do not have a very straight yes or no answer at this moment to say that, these are the steps which they should take. But I feel the kind of things which they're doing on ground. I mean, for example, if let's say the state or the local, try to connect or trying to emphasize more programs where they can still stay in their villages, be connected with the landscape in the even in the kind of new livelihood practices which they do, I think will make more sense. Because, I mean, for example, I'll just briefly tell you about a trek. So there's a very famous place in Uttarkashi called Dayara Bugyal Trek. So there are like 3-4 villages at the bottom of this, trek. So, you can basically go to the grassland from any of these villages. So what these locals are doing, they themselves have started to, have their, I think it's I think common in a lot of Himalayan, they have their own village eco development council. So, they control the number of tourists who should go. They control the kind of activities which should happen. They themselves are basically managing a lot of homestays, or their families are managing the homestays. So what they're trying to, what they're trying to stem is the outmigration. A lot of people post-COVID actually returned to their villages, because everyone had to come back. And then they realized that these new opportunities can be tapped on. So actually, 1/3 of the village only went back. People who were only doing day laborer jobs only went back. People who were, significantly educated enough actually stayed back, and they've started their own livelihood practices. They are not, let's say, directly linked with the landscape. I mean, they're not doing what their fathers and mothers were doing with the forest and with cultivation, but they're still trying to reconnect themselves with the forest, with the landscape in a way. So, I mean, that's how I would like to answer this.
Thank you. So we have 2 questions from 2 of our participants. I would like to invite Monami, if you can ask your question to our speakers.
Thank you. It was a really great presentation. I got to learn a lot of new things. So my question here would be, like from your case studies, is it visible that the places which are less developed, the people are more connected to the rivers and vice versa? So if there's more development, people are less connected to the rivers or the natural body.
If I can answer, I think we have to first start, understanding what development means for people who stay in villages, if they are developed versus not. I mean, I personally found that a lot of youth, people aged between 15 years to 25 years in the Garhwal are as equal to, their peers in Delhi. They have access to social media. I think they are more strong on social media. They are more mobile than people of their age in the city. I mean, they're traveling more because, they understand that they have to. So I think the first question is that we have to first understand what development means. The second is, especially in the Himalayas, and I think this is across the whole Himalayas, it's not a question of that, they are not connected or they're connected. I think it's a matter of environment creates this own difficulties by itself. I mean, for example, most of these villages have an average population of, let's say, 250 to 300 people. I mean, it's an average. Some villages can be even 1,000, persons. But let's say on an average, you have 150, let's say 250 to 300. So what becomes critical is that you can't cut down any forest which you see. I mean, for the cow which eats a specific kind of leaf, you have to go to a specific part of the forest to get that leaf. The fuel which you will burn in your house has to be from a specific kind of a tree. You can't cut every single thing. And even water is also very critical. I mean, some of the water is now becoming very difficult. So most of the streams are being dying. So people in themselves have, this inbuilt practice of, what should be conserved, what should be basically, what you should also sort of worship and, keep its sanctity. So, I mean, for example, if you go to villages, and I also showed in my presentation, most of the water sources always have a temple. whenever you start to get into a forest, it will have a small deity shrine. It is these small practices which continue to do so. And I think these activities or these practices you will see more in rural areas versus, let's say, in urban areas. I mean, I think we should classify them like that rather than developed versus non-developed.
Thank you.
And have our next question from Vishwanath Parmar. If you could go ahead and ask our speakers. Mr. Vishwanath Parmar, if you can ask the question to our speakers, please. Okay, I think he's traveling and it's not possible for him to speak. I would ask on his behalf. He is saying that, can we say that ancestral wisdom of environment protection plays a better role than today's more advanced techniques and tools in all cases of mapping the facts before any development proposals? Would you want me to repeat it once again?
I think they are waiting. Who are you asking this question to? So, Proshakha. Okay, Ashim, you may take the question, please. Yeah.
Ancestral wisdom, or let's say traditional knowledge, really has a lot of role to play. But unfortunately, I think in today's circumstances, I would say that these wisdom, or let's say these ways of seeing the world are also limited. I mean, these practices did not, appear, I mean, let's say overnight. I mean, they themselves also happened over centuries and centuries of, doing something. It was basically learning through trial and error. And they are established practices. And I mean, I would not say they are not, I mean, as I said, they did not come up in time. But unfortunately, today, the speed and the scale of development and these large-scale projects, I think we really also need to understand the role of modern technology. I mean, for example, now we have fantastic methods of understanding, even weather forecast, which are, I mean, we can now to the minute forecast weather that, when exactly the rain will stop. I think we also need to incorporate a lot of scientific and, let's say, the modern technologies and methods and things which are there to our disposal. But I think both the traditional practices and, let's say, the modern techniques should actually, combine and go hand in hand. I mean, a lot of decision making can be, let's say, done through traditional practices, through, let's say, modern day GIS and mapping methods. But once it has to be brought on ground, then I think the traditional practices and, let's say, local practices should really take over.
Yeah. Shaka, would you like to unmute? And if you have any questions, or maybe Vibhu or Vibhu, would you like to ask a question? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, wonderful conversation. Congratulations, Ashim and Manna, for such wonderful work. I'm really looking forward to read. If you have published anything, please share that in the group. Something which is very interesting. And the work of Ashim, for instance, is of a specific interest to me because, I have a project on riverine rights. So, in the context of Ganga particularly, so that makes us, and that's something which very interesting. And also, thanks for sharing the book. I have not heard about them. This seems to be quite interesting. Yeah. So, and I have a question for both of you because you have been working on 2 different rivers and also working in this area of riverscapes culture. As I understand I have very limited understanding of the rivers, the governance system. I'm entirely new to this, trying to learn because I have to write the report, very instrumental purposes. And I have been a student of governance for quite for quite some time. When it comes to the people river kind of interactions, as I try to understand the the policies or even like some of the research papers, I could see that people are either the consumers of the river, I mean the tourists, right, or the destroyers of the river, like are the ones who are polluting. Most of the policies or the programs is around these two larger, broader kinds of conceptualization of people. And when you're bringing the culture, and it aids both, as I understand. Like, I mean, we use the culture to promote tourism around the rivers, right? So, like, for instance, like when the government organizes this Kumbh or all other festivals, if you look at the structure, it's not all about like recognizing the culture. It's all about the revenue generation model for the government, right? And like related managing the law and order and all that kind. So how do you think this idea of the connection that people have, right? Which that's what the cultural context is, and that's what I think both of you are trying to argue through your paper. How these idea of the relationship between people and nature, right, that forms the basis of this culture that we are talking about, can be more like something which is certainly beyond these instrumental purposes, right? Like, I mean, people as either as the consumers of those, or like on the consumer, they're also polluters, and like which go beyond this revenue generation model. How do you think we can streamline or mainstream these cultural context, right? When I say cultural context, I'm not talking about the specific religious or reverences for the river, but this connection that people have, right, with the river into the governance framework. Sorry if I confused you. I'm actually confused. So. Yeah, any one of you can. Is my question clear? Or
Ashim, please go ahead.
Ashim is nodding, so
go ahead,
no,
Ashim.
I thought, Hannah, you could maybe shed some light from, because you interacted with a lot of local people.
So is the question how to incorporate cultural the cultural connection that the people have to the river,
yes.
In policy? Is that the question?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I think with reference to our project, I will speak in that sense. For the HWell project, our ultimate objective was to come up with recommendations which will inform policy. So some of our, post all this data collection and analysis of how, in the case of Gwalior, we're saying, okay, the river is important and its ecological value should be revived, and this should be at the center of policy that the government formulates. And also in the case of Orcha, we say the idyllic nature of the town of Orcha should be preserved, and views and view sheds, mapping of view sheds should be done, and all this is part of cultural connections, right? How people see the landscape, how Orcha is viewed as this town in the middle of nowhere that nobody can access easily, and so breaking down these aspects and saying, okay, these are the recommendations that we think should be incorporated in policy. I don't think it's a process that's been figured out. We're still saying, okay, we think this is how we should do it. We think these are the things that should be priorities when you're formulating policy. And to bring it more to highlight them and bring them to the forefront is what we've tried to do with the HWell approach. So that's why I think it's still an approach. It's not a policy document. It's still in process. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe I will chip in a little bit. Ashim, do you want to add something to what Hannah was saying?
I think there's a small thing which I would like to add. It's actually the role of culture which is bringing all of us to the rivers first. I mean, maybe it is for, let's say, spiritual needs or recreational needs, but it's a way of, things which are built. And I think often we forget to, I would agree with Bibu that we are only monetizing the monetary part of the culture, only looking at revenue sources and how it can be. This whole reason of, building so much of large scale infrastructure in the Himalayas. And it's just to make sure that, people can, make quick travels, reach their destinations earlier and then, basically join their offices back in time so that, they get this weekend Himalaya. Unfortunately, that's a big problem. For example, we have been actually forgetting how we used to negotiate with culture. How culture actually emerged from the society's negotiation with landscape in itself. I think, I don't know, maybe policymakers, when people are actually writing policies, you should really have experts on culture also included in part, even large scale infrastructural projects. They should really have them.
Yeah, I think very important point you raised, Ashim, that when policies, even for large scale infrastructure, for that matter, highways or bridges, cultural people from cultural background and for I think even psychology background should be also part of the team which are drafting these policies. But just to add to what both of you were saying, when we talk about how a culture can be ingrained or is ingrained into policy making, it is ingrained into the policy making, I believe. But the fact that culture itself is changing over time, what was culture earlier in the past, if I refer it to the Himalayas, and the forests, people at the old age used to visit Himalayas and forests and Char Dham. And now you see even a toddler with the parents is visiting Char Dham, and youth are visiting the Himalayas 100 times in their lifespan of 15 years of youth. So this is a changed culture itself, So just to give an example, so if culture is changing, it is also bringing that change into the policy discourse. Now it's a matter of chicken and egg. What is changing before? Whether policy is bringing a change in the culture, which is quite likely, and even culture, the changed culture is also further changing the policy itself, because those sitting in the boardrooms are the ones who would like that ease of access to the places. 20 years ago, Haridwar Rishikesh was completely different place than what it is today. Today, you have to really go out with a microscopic, telescopic view to find pilgrims. You can just see tourists all over. It's a tourist place than a pilgrim place now. So that's a change in radical shift in the culture of the place, even if people who go for their last rites, Visarjan and all, they are just thronging to the place. Whereas in Hindu culture in the past, if I read it a little bit to my understanding, people used to actually use the last rite for in their local rivers. Not everybody was heading to Ganga. It is just the commercialization of the place and, promoting Ganga to that extent that everybody wants to go and do it in Ganga instead of their local river. I recall from my own family trails that it was more in the local river, all the religious ceremonial activities of birth to marriage to death. These are the major events which was all related to the local river, and to a large extent in West Bengal, even ponds were equally important, if not for the last rites, but rest of the things were all pond culture, and so if everybody is rushing to Ganga for all kinds of things, and in addition to skiing and all those sky gliding and paragliding and God knows what and trekking, we are already talking about changed culture. So anyway, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. We have overboarded the time of the session, so that really pushes me to announce closure for today's discussion. But thank you so much, Ashim and Hannah, for the wonderful presentation and bringing out the case studies in a very simple way, which youth can understand, and you both being the youth and future of tomorrow to decide for our rivers and natural resources. It's really good to see how you are looking at these things a little bit differently than those sitting in the policy are looking at them. And thanks, Proshakha, for discussing the very relevant questions from the heart of a youth. So before I do the closure for the session today, let me just announce for other sessions. So this week, Friday, we have the Thesis Club, and we are discussing disentangling the drivers of domestic water scarcity in the Eastern Himalaya region with Rinan Shah, a PhD scholar. And the coming Wednesday, which is May 24th, we are actually meeting a maestro, Padma Shri Lakshman Singh from Rajasthan, who is going to talk about the Chauka technology, and which is a very age-old traditional water harvesting system of Rajasthan. And we are going to have this session in Hindi. And the next Friday is on water arts, and that's on 26th of May, where we are going to listen and do a film release or documentary release on Use of Diamond by a very young artist and filmmaker and music composer Faraz Khan. So that's the announcement, recent announcement for coming 10 days. And thank you so much, all of you. And thanks all the participants for making Wednesdays and Fridays meaningful for these water conversations. We strongly believe that conversations are extremely crucial for conservation. And that's our motto for Wednesdays and Fridays session. And with these lines, let me again say thanks to all the speakers and participants, and please take care of yourself and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.